Hi, Oliver. It's great connecting again.
Hi, Ante. Welcome to the end of the semester. I'm looking forward to the next week when finally we're in new waters.
Yes. And I saw you the other day walking with a backpack across campus. You are really ready for your major trip that we've talked about before.
Yeah. We ran into each other in the wellness center here, beautiful wellness center here at Andrews University. One reason why you should come to Andrews. And yeah, I'm training the last couple of weeks with weighted backpacks to get the sensation on the hips dialed in, and obviously also fat max training that gets me ready for Denali. I'm really happy to know that I'm leaving next week Wednesday. I'm flying to Anchorage and then from there onto the glacier. So I'm really dreaming every night of the adventure that awaits me in a couple of days.
I can't wait to hear more about it. I mean, I know you probably won't have whatever internet connection or even satellite connection where you are. So it will have to be after the trip that you tell us about what happened and all these adventures. I hope you will take photos. Will you be able to take some photos and videos?
Yeah, I got an Insta360. That's kind of similar to a GoPro, but it takes videos 360. So it's kind of a round picture, and you can select then afterwards what you want to shoot. That makes photographing and recording much easier, because then you don't need to think all the time about what's the good direction and where's the sun shining and am I missing something. So it's just pretty easy to just put on the camera and have it record, and then later in the evening or so you can make your video cuts. It's actually, I didn't know about Insta360 or these 360 cameras until, 2 years ago. I was climbing on the Watzmann East face and ran into another solo climber, and he had this Insta360 and was wondering, what is that? And then we looked later at the footage he created, and I thought, this is the way forward. You can capture so many impressions that you would otherwise miss, or you would need much more time to place, a camera at the right position, and think much more about settings and positions and lighting and all these types of things. So anyway, yeah. So what is actually waiting for you once the semester is over?
You know what?
I mean, we
are leaving very soon for Croatia. Again, connecting with family members. So it's going to be very nice. So wrapping things up. Finishing some projects, interesting projects. We'll continue to work there for a while. And obviously, I don't want to derail our recording, but we are in a very interesting sports season.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So Giro d'Italia, which is probably the nicest grand tours in terms of, the images of the countryside. That's beautiful. And by the way, again, I don't
this
want
Friday.
to It's Friday. Is it Friday? Oh, yeah, it's Friday, not Sunday,
I think
right?
I think the prologue is this Friday. I'm not sure whether they start with a prologue, but it's this Friday.
Yes. Yeah, and by the way, just a side comment, as you know, I'm a Bayern fan, and we are now in Champions League semifinals. I mean, what people say, and I've heard this from coaches, from players, that the game with PSG is one of the greatest game they've ever seen, like long-term commentators. It was unbelievable. I kid you not. I watched it. I blocked the time. I was so emotionally drained that I was ready to go to bed. It was an unbelievable game. So anyone who loves soccer, if you can access on Paramount here in the US, you can probably watch it. It was unbelievable.
So yeah. Ante, I'll bring a 6-pack with some good alcohol-free beer from Bavaria, and I'll visit you tomorrow evening at your place if you can watch it. Actually, lunchtime, right, or early afternoon.
Yes, it's
tomorrow
here.
Is the day, right?
Man, it is. Yeah, it's the return game, and it's going to be as crazy. The Allianz Arena and all these Bayern fans, and it's going to be great. But in any case. So about that, let's go to our episode, and I'm very excited that we have a just phenomenal theme. I'm not exaggerating. for several reasons phenomenal, because of a beautiful project you have worked on for quite some time, but also because of the timeliness of what you write about in the, well, Lamentations commentary, which is about to be published, I hope, in the near future. But if you allow me, I would like to set kind of the table by mentioning or by stating or relating two examples, which I think are incredibly good entry points. They will provide good entry points into discussing this commentary. And the first one, and I don't know, you might be familiar with this, actually comes from a book by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope: Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. And it's an account that was written by a farmer, a trapper, a hunter, a cowboy who moved in 1885 to Montana. And while he lived there, he encountered Plenty Coups, who was the last great chief of the Crow Nation. And they became friends, and they talked a lot about the changes that the Crow Nation obviously experienced. And there was this great passage in the book that he eventually wrote. And this is the quotation I wanted to share. This is what Linderman wrote. Plenty Coups refused to speak of his life after the passing of the buffalo. You know, as we know, the buffalo was basically near exterminated in many of the places in which Native American Indians lived. So Plenty Coups refused to speak of his life after the passing of the buffalo, so that his story seems to have been broken off, leaving many years unaccounted for. I've not told you half of what happened when I was young, he said. I can think back and tell you much more of war and horse-telling. But when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. And listen to this sentence. After this, nothing happened. End of experience. There was little singing anywhere. And you could see all of these things happen to us when the buffalo went away. That is exhibit number one. Exhibit number two, it is a kind of wonderful essay by Walter Benjamin, and you will be familiar with it, titled Experiencing in Poverty, written in the aftermath of World War I. So Walter Benjamin is this famous German literary critic who has influenced many important people later on associated with the Frankfurt School. And he writes about this experience of what happened during World War I. He writes that this is a generation, right, that has gone to school in horse-drawn streetcars, and now stood in the open air amid a landscape in which nothing was the same except the clouds, and at its center, in a force field of destructive torrents and explosions, the tiny, fragile human body. So there's this whole idea, right, that after this tremendous collapse of civilization, where people with the connection with the past completely disappeared, and this exposure to death and new technology left people basically without being able to share their experiences. Because according to Benjamin, this is the last thing I want to say, he calls experience a continued state phenomenon. So it is an experience of a phenomena of continuity. Like what you're experiencing today can only fully be an experience if you can connect it in some meaningful way to the past. And so since people were not able to do that, they were consigned to silence. So with these two examples in mind, Oliver, I'm thinking about your Lamentations commentary and what people have experienced, the people of God have experienced as a result of the destruction of the temple and the exile it seems to me that there are very interesting existential and experiential overlaps with this idea the buffalo is gone and that's it. There's nothing after that. So before we perhaps go into some of the questions that I'm deeply interested in exploring with you, tell us a little bit more about your engagement with Jeremiah. You've been in Jeremiah, if I can put it that way, for many, many years. Was there a reason specifically that you are attracted to Jeremiah more broadly, and the book Jeremiah and then Lamentations? And so tell us a little bit more about your engagement with that book.
Yeah, so Lamentations is definitely a book that I have not been really interested in for the majority of my life, so to say. The same could be said about Jeremiah, at least for the first 28 years of my life. But then I studied at the Free University of Amsterdam in a research group there, and we were doing a syntactic analysis of the Hebrew Bible. So it's a big database that has been worked on in the Pastoral Center of Bible and Computing. And I was assigned to do such work on the book of Jeremiah, which is a book that, you know well, is the largest book in the entire Old Testament, or the entire Bible itself. By far, it's bigger than the books you would expect, Psalms or Job. And it's a very complicated book as well. So it's not something that would automatically it's not something that makes you feel excited about, just because of the sheer labor that it requires and the complexities that it contains. So I was not really into the book of Jeremiah. It was basically my employment at the ETCBC that forced me to work with that book. But I really fell in love with Jeremiah once you really are forced to dig deep and not just pick some of those famous texts out of the New Covenant text, for example, Jeremiah 31 till 33. Then you get a sense of the complexities of many in many levels, be that reductional complexities, text critical complexities, but also the language complexities, the theological complexities. So since then, I basically, for the last 15 years or so, I'm a disciple of Jeremiah. And as that, I was asked to write the new SDA Bible commentary on the book of Jeremiah. And then often it comes kind of as part of the package that you also cover Lamentations. Many Jeremiah commentators would also cover Lamentations because it's a book that directly follows the book of Jeremiah. It has very similar language. In several traditions, it is regarded to share the same author. So Jeremiah writing both the book of Jeremiah as well as the book of Lamentations. Anyway, in that way, I got the Lamentations book also onto my desk with a request to write a commentary on it as well.
Beautiful. So why don't we then go into this text, because there are so many, the commentary raises so many beautiful points and deeply relevant for specifically our day. And I want to begin by reading verse 3 in chapter 1. So this is Lamentations 1, verse 3. It writes, and this is from the ESV, I believe, after affliction and harsh labor, Judah had gone into exile. She dwells among the nations, she finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. I mean, this is profound trauma language. We can talk about trauma a little bit later, but this language of harsh labor, affliction, distress, and everything. But I am interested in this word, no resting place. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so please correct me if I mispronounce it. But I believe that the word is manoach, I believe. Am I pronouncing this correct?
Yep, that's right.
Manoach. And I think if I recall rightly in your commentary, at least in what you've shared with me, you're writing about this as describing something more than simply a geographical space. It's deeper than that. I think that's what you say. So this is, in other words, not just exile from place, but the deprivation of the very condition right? Existential ontological condition that makes habitation possible. In other words, you're talking about this almost as describing a mode of being. So why do you read it that way? Do I read it correctly the way you interpret this? And how do you distinguish the reading that you're providing from simply saying, oh, they were homesick?
Mhm.
And what is really theologically at stake for you in the particular reading that you provide of that verse?
Yeah, yeah. No, excellent. I love the way how you introduced our episode now with these references to Radical Hope. I'm not sure, I definitely haven't read Radical Hope, but I thought I have heard a reference to it in Paul Kingsnorth Erasmus lecture. Could that be the case? I think
I
he
think
speaks about
of some
also
other chief, I think, though.
yeah, okay, yes, yes. But it was related to kind of the absolute
Yes, sure.
collapse of culture, right? Actually, it was by your suggestion that I listened to the lecture of Paul Kingsnorth in, when was that? March, while I was going on the ski trip in Utah, and it affected me on several levels. And we also said we should discuss this in one of our next episodes as well. But the way how you introduce us with the buffalo was not there anymore, and after that there was nothing, right? So everything stopped, I think is a very good description of what lamentation is referencing in this verse 3 of chapter 1 that we're just reading, particularly with this term, and not did she find manuach, right? So there's resting place. So there's a little bit of a background to this term as it opens, so to say, the plain without buffaloes, or the world that is no longer existing. The root of this word manoach is nuach, and it appears already in Genesis chapter 2 as a central term. It's used there when it said that God placed Adam and Eve in the garden. It's the word nuach, and he nuacht them in the Garden of Eden. So this is the first component that is important before, when we build the argument, so to say, or prepare the scene that Lamentations 1 verse 3 is painting. So it is the garden metaphor, or the garden realm, that is connected to the word nuach for the first time. And obviously this is a perfect space. It's a space where you can expand your living, where you can explore the goodness of life, where you're safe, but where it's not about safety, but much more about exploration. So living the good life. So this word nuach does not only have a spatial connotation to it. Obviously, it's being used then later in the Pentateuch, particularly in Deuteronomy, as a reference to the land of Canaan. So it's the resting place. It's the promised land. It's a good place where milk and honey flow. It is also used as a reference to time. When the first creation story climaxes with the Sabbath, and the Lord rested on the Sabbath days, or as in Hebrew it says it, and the Lord Sabbathed on the seventh day. The Decalogue, both in Exodus 20 as well as Deuteronomy 5, will use not the verb Shabbath to Sabbath. It will use the word nuach. And the Lord nuacht on the seventh day. Therefore, you should also keep the Sabbath. So the word nuach obviously refers also to an experience of time, not just an experience of place, but an experience of time. And therefore, the term menuach, or here a little alteration of the word menucha, manuach, refers to an experience where time and space come together as a reality of experience that is full of meaning, that is safe, that is good, that is full, that is embracing your identity, your family connections, your networks, your work experiences, and so on. So therefore, when it says, and she did not find Manoach, it's referring to the collapse of both space and time. So you could say in the world of the Pentateuch, and in Old Testament theology as such, you could argue there is no good space without a good time, and there is no good time without a good space. So you cannot enjoy your life without having property, so to say. The full life is also a life where the individual owns property, but owning property is not enough. So you could say the material wealth that you can gather around you is not enough. You also need the quality of time. So these are the two components that are obviously lost here.
And it's very interesting to make this connection with time, because I distinctly remember reading Abraham Joshua Heschel's The Sabbath, because that's exactly what he is writing about, that is the thing that God creates on the seventh day. He creates the rest. He creates menucha, and then also makes this beautiful connection between Sabbath and that Sabbath rest. And if I'm not also mistaken, and I think this is also that I got this from Heschel, that when you read Psalm 23, right, besides still waters, it is the waters of menuchot. It is this idea of rest that is there. So rest obviously has such a profound, deep existential meaning. It means coming to oneself, being transparent before God, living in the presence of God. It refers to the flourishing of shalom in a just society. It means rootedness in symbols of meaning that structure your life. And when that collapses, God is seemingly absent. You are removed from these rituals that gave you meaning, from the community that provided you with identity. So all of that is kind of destroyed. And I think it seems to me that if I'm correctly understand you, it seems to be a proper angle, not the proper angle, seems to be one of those major optics by which you actually approach the whole book. And as you write about this book, you are doing something very interesting. For me, this was new. For other scholars probably who know about this literature, it probably is way more familiar. But you're arguing that this book actually presents an alphabet of mourning, that we have an acrostic structure. So we have this very strange thing, like, so what you try to do, and help me understand this a bit more. In some ways, it is a book of chaos, right? He's all over the place. He's trying to make sense of this collapsed world, and not just collapsed world, but really struggling with the seeming apparent absence of God and divine intervention. And yet you're telling us that's this kind of, on the one hand, we have this chaos, but then we have this structure in the book. So can you a little bit explain how these things work in Lamentations?
Yeah, perhaps for the listener to get a sense of these, let's say, incongruencies that we face in this book, as you're referring to them, to give two examples. You have strong expressions of, why is this happening to me? This is unjust, this is unjust, this is unjust. And then you can have in the next verse saying, well, I'm guilty because I did not obey the word of the Lord, and I deserve what I'm going through. And then it can swap again into acknowledgments of injustice. So, and you wonder, what are you now? Are you reflecting your own guilt, or are you reflecting that the injustice you experience is undeserved? So that's one of the contrasts, for example. Another contrast would be, I mean, obviously at the center of the poem in chapter 3, verses 21 till 43a, I think it is. There you have these famous texts of "Your mercies are new every day," and it's beautiful, beautiful poetry that we hear in the churches quite often. What we don't hear is the verses that you read before we launch into this beautiful poem of God's character and love and mercy and beauty, and the verses that follow, namely that God does not listen. That you can ask for forgiveness, but he will not forgive. So this is another typical contrast that you find in the book of Lamentations. So is God good now, or is he evil? So you have God as the one who is faithful, and then God as the one who is like a hunter trying to throw arrows at you and has just fun killing you. So these are the incongruencies or the incoherencies, or at least apparent incoherences in this poem. On the other side, however, you have the structure, right? It's still predictable on several levels. The structure, as you said, is acrostic, so it means it goes through all chapters, with the exception of one, go through the alphabet. So you have, for example, chapter 1, verse 1. I'm just having it open here. It starts with the first letter of the alphabet, the Aleph, and then the second verse is the second letter, Bet, and then the third verse is the third letter. And as you have in the Hebrew alphabet 22 letters, you have 22 verses. This acrostic structure then continues in chapter 2. So there we also have 22 verses. Why? Because there are 22 letters. Or when you go to chapter 3, there you have 66 verses, which of course then, even if you don't know Hebrew with that little bit background, you probably can guess already what's happening. We have 3 verses that all run around one letter. So the first 3 verses are the first letter. The second 3 verses are the second letter, and so on. So there's structure in the poem. It's not just that there is structure in the poem, there's also, let's say, sound units. So it likes to play with anaphors and epiphors with similar word endings, titi, 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 for example. So obviously this is not a chaotic text that is just collected from different compartments of memory or experiences, but somebody is designing this text. And that makes the incoherences even more interesting, because you think, if you are designing this text and you build so much structure around it, why do you not also structure the content, right? Why do you also not cohere your theology? That's really the challenge and the invitation, I think, of every reader, to work with these seemingly opposing phenomena in this book. Content seems to be unorganized, while the structure seems to be very rigid and very organized.
This really reminds me, I think you might recall, we once had a conversation, which I also think we recorded. We had an episode on divine suffering. You remember way back, we talked about Theology, and you might recall that I shared this experience when I was at the University of Chicago, still a student, and at that time the bookstore was probably one of the best bookstores in the country. An amazing bookstore. It had almost like a catacomb. It had these pipes, water pipes. You had kind of to duck, and you would go to these aisles. Such an unusual
Beautiful
place. Amazing. It was in the basement of some building. Now they've moved out, but it was just this great place. And I don't know, you might recall that one day I was perusing books, and I remember that moment, Oliver. I remember that moment taking a book from the shelf by David Blumenthal, a Jewish theologian, and who writes the book Facing the Abusing God. And it was basically on the book of Job, written in the style of a midrash. So the text of Job is in the middle and a commentary at the end. I don't know, this experience, I literally felt an electric current from the top of my head going through me. It really, because I was at that time going through some very difficult moments that could not understand divine non-intervention. So this idea, and the basic idea is from his reading of the book of Job, that the book of Job suggests that there is some unaccounted darkness in God that is not quite transparent, that makes him stand against us. And I'm thinking of this as I read Lamentations chapter 2, which has this just unbelievable image of God as the divine warrior, but who set himself against the people of God. I mean, just listen to some of this language. It's the whole of chapter 2. It writes about God's anger. He has withdrawn his right hand. He has burned like a flaming fire in Jacob, consuming all around. This is verse 3. And then verse 4. He has bent his bow like an enemy, with his right hand set like a foe. And he has killed all who were delightful in our eyes. in the tent of the daughter of Zion. He has poured out his fury like fire. The Lord has become like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces. He has laid waste his gardens, and so on and so forth. So this is incredibly powerful and evocative language. So as you engaged chapter 2, how did you interpret that? I mean, I wouldn't say that Jeremiah is a proto David Blumenthal, but when he writes this, is he writing this from the perspective that divine wrath is completely justified? Or is there an element of puzzlement that he cannot quite make sense of it, of the ferociousness and the intensity of God, the warrior standing against his people? From what place, experiential, spiritual place, is he writing this?
Yeah. It's definitely confusion. So he cannot make sense of it. I think as a reader, we often try to, let's say, get a different perspective and then cohere, so to say, the output of the poet. And I think there are possible ways of understanding this. Obviously, one of them would be the trauma lens, but I think this is not the only possible lens. You can also cast a theological shadow, so to say, over this, and it can be brought to some meaningful place, I think. But yeah, there's confusion with the author. I'm just thinking, as you are referring to Blumenthal, I think the second to last album that Leonard Cohen was publishing was You Want It Darker, also from this rich Jewish tradition. If it be your will, and then you want it darker, and if it be your will that I sing no more, right? You have kind of these interesting dark reflections on the dark or hidden or mysterious side of the good God. So that's what you find definitely in chapter 2 on. And I guess you plan to go to chapter 3 too, because the sounding of these negative images continues. But if I try to make sense of it by coming from the book of Jeremiah, let me try to cast what is happening from a reader's perspective. In the book of Jeremiah, we also have a very emotional entity. And that emotional entity is, in contrast to Lamentations, is God himself. He is the one who is weeping. He is the one who is crying. And in the speeches that you find in Jeremiah, in the divine speeches, a typical reoccurring phrase is my people, or the daughter of my people, the daughter of my people. So God is the speaker who uses this phrase, the daughter of my people, and he's weeping and crying. Now, when we transition into the book of Lamentations, something interesting happens, because the daughter of my people appears there too, constantly. But it's no longer God who's speaking. It's now the poet. If you take a traditional perspective, it's the prophet who is now using these words. So as if the crying of Yahweh has come to an end in the book of Jeremiah, and the task or the question now is, who will continue crying now? So who will take over this task of God? And that's the poet then who does it. In fact, he starts with the first word already. It's like, how come? How does it come? So the whole poem, in a sense, is set up to explore the confusions of the cry. So the confusion of the crying agent in Jeremiah, Yahweh, are very clear. So you have God himself who seems to be contradicting himself. I hate you and then I love you, or I don't want to see you anymore, go away, and then the next verse is that please come back. So the confusion is here centered in Adonai, or in God himself. In Lamentations, it's interesting, there it is centered in the poet, and God is the absent one. So you could almost say in the book of Jeremiah, the people are the absent one, and God is the present weeper and sufferer. And in the book of Lamentation, it turns around, and God is the silent one, and the prophet the poet representing the community is now the weeping one. So it's confusion. So divine confusion in Jeremiah, human confusion in the book of Lamentations. And I think that's an interesting route, kind of, that these two books open up for us to walk and to make this a fruitful theological exercise. But to your question, chapter 2, confusion. Chapter 1 already starts with why. Why is this? Why is this happening to me? So a question that is until the very end not answered.
So this is very interesting, because this is exactly perhaps the point at which some people might push back against what you're trying to suggest. And if for instance, someone might think that what you're trying to do, you are imposing a kind of post-World War II existential anxiety, or let me rephrase it, or post-World War II existentialism with its emphasis on displacement and anxiety, that kind of vocabulary that is so prominent in these writers, that you're imposing that onto an ancient text, that actually what you're presenting as being underdetermined or not quite closed, that is actually not true, because people find it incredibly discomforting that somehow the book does not end on a note of hope. And for instance, it could be argued along the following ways. I mean, when you think about chapter 3, which you have mentioned, I mean, that chapter is absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah.
When I say to my wife, why are we complaining about life? Let us just read this. What he's going through now. He drew into my kidneys the arrows of his quiver. He has filled me with bitterness, verse 15. Verse 16 is one of my favorite one. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cover in ashes. And there are other things that he mentions there. And then comes this...
Ante, if I may, just a couple of verses before that, because it has this intensity. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. Yes. He turned aside my steps and tore me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow and set me as a target for his arrow. Yeah, I mean, in symphony with what you were just quoting.
That's an unbelievable chapter. And so when I think about this passage, Oliver, actually, this is a passage that I often turn to in very difficult moments. I would have to look back a little bit in my sermon notes, but I am pretty sure that this is something, not the first part of this chapter, I would leave it out conveniently, but verse 21, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And I remember me preaching on it and saying that for me, one of the most astonishing words in the whole Bible is the word but, or but, or yet. And I would even ask rhetorically to myself, I would ask myself, but also in preaching, where is this coming from? What is the ground of that small conjunction? How is that even possible based on what we see in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, what he experiences? Is this wishful thinking? He says, this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. So I would like you, if you can, a little bit unpack the meaning. So I have two questions in this regard. First of all, my first question is he basically against his senses engaging in theology? That he is refusing the reality to define who God is for him, and that he is insisting on something that he believes to be true, but nothing in his environment can justify. And the second question, based probably on how you will interpret that, could it be that this one single word, this conjunction, basically perhaps goes against your argument that this book is kind of left open, it's a bit fluid, it doesn't have a complete resolution, that actually everything that we read in Lamentations needs to be refracted, read through this affirmation of faith. So I'm very curious how you engage with that.
Oh man, there are now several strings that you're pulling, right? For example, the trauma lens. Am I using your trauma lens? I would like to say a little bit more about this here also, perhaps in a minute. Then what is really the message is perhaps in the very center of the of the poem, the very core of the theology that he arrives at. And we should consider this to be the climax, the high point, the resolution of it all. So let me tackle the last one first. This is not how I read it, and I think it's difficult to read it that way, namely that the center of Lamentations here with the verses that you're referring to, verse 21, with this but this I call to mind, ending then with prayers of repentance, that this is the climax. And I would argue that there are a couple of reasons for this not being the theological arrival point. Number one is that we have this contrast that starts with verse 21. So we have all these dark verses that the two of us were just quoting, and then all of a sudden, at least the ESV translators, so as a resistance to all this negativity, but there is this positive theology that I'm clinging to, and I do have hope, nevertheless, right? So why then are we in verse 42b, having a very similar disruptive...
Chapter 3, right? Sorry, we're still in chapter 3. Yes.
Yeah, so you have this beautiful, from verse 21 till verse 42a, these moments of clinging to the abundance and the steadfast love of God, and trusting that he will forgive, and knowing that he will not judge you forever, but that long term he always has your restoration in mind, and grace and mercy. The Lord will return, verse 40, right? And therefore we can come to him and confess and share our, let's say, concerns of our own immorality and bring it to God, and he will deal justly with it. When I'm looking at verse 41, let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and we have rebelled. So, moment of repentance. But then the second half of verse 42 is, and you have not forgiven. And then it goes the entire avalanche back into this dark space of we are lost, we are forgotten. If you look at verse 44, we pray, but he has put a cloud between us and you, so no prayers are going through. So if really the poet is on a move towards a resolution, he has just destroyed it again. So this is one argument. Number two is that the very end of the poem is clearly not coming to a conclusion. Rather, it ends with a question in the Hebrews. Are you bitter, or how is the ESV translating it? ESV is kind of nice. It says, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. So it has this, perhaps you have utterly rejected us, and you might actually be angry forever with us. So it's not coming, it's ending with a question. It's ending with doubt.
Yeah, if I can jump in very quickly, because this is, I think, something, if I remember correctly, because you actually, and you tell me if this is true or not, I might be misremembering, but you are actually juxtaposing 522, if I remember correctly, with 422, because it seems to me that in 422 you have this idea, the punishment of your iniquity, your daughter of Zion, is accomplished. He will keep you in exile no longer. So it's almost like what one hand giveth, the other hand taketh away, then in 522. So there seems to be an inkling of a resolution. I think that's what you say, right? At the end of chapter 4, only then to end again the way
right,
what you've quoted now in chapter 5, right?
Yeah, exactly. So the contrast between, let's say, the merciful, forgiving God and the absent, cruel God that we encounter in chapter 3 at these transition points reappears at the very end of the poem. So I don't see that we have made any progress, so to say, on the theological front or on the resolution front. And third, what is in the ESV translated as but, so as the kind of the contrast, the resistance, is absent in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, there is no conjunction. In the Hebrew, you have zod, this. It's a demonstrative pronoun. Let me go here. But this I call to mind. In the Hebrew, it says, this I return towards my heart. And the question, and that's a puzzling thing here, is what does this, the demonstrative pronoun, refer to? What is this? It's the pronoun is usually used, like in English, to refer to something that has been mentioned before. And the only thisness, so to say, that is before, is that my soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me, and refers to the afflictions and the wandering. So all the suffering is the last antecedent, so it's the last participant that it could refer to with the word with this. And I would suggest that the remembrance of the suffering triggers directly also the remembrance of God's grace. So it's at the moment, if you go through the Old Testament, Judges, for example, or the book of Exodus, right? It's at the moment where the suffering is the worst. Then what we have learned is at that moment, God cannot continue to ignore, right? He needs to do something. And it seems to be these, let's say, trained models of theology or these models of experience that trigger this shift in verse 21. So we are at the very bottom. Therefore, our hope must come. So So I don't see the theological climax at the center of the book of Lamentations, but I see a theological task, so to say, for the reader, getting to its high point at the center of the book of Lamentations.
So I wonder, I am, of course, we recognize the Bible as a sacred text and inspired. We are not undermining anything of that with our desire to understand it. But a reader perhaps who might come with questions could ask the following: well, what is then going on in Lamentations? Might this be a presentation of a confused and wrong theology? What I mean by that is, as you know, we've talked about it in the past. Jürgen Moltmann has been instrumental for me as a young person when I started developing my theological outlook. And one of the central, and he, as you know, was deeply engaging Jewish thinkers. That makes his theology really profoundly attractive in that sense. And one of the, as you know, the key category, one should always be very careful in using the term key category, because people are complex thinkers and everything, but certainly a dominant category in Jürgen Moltmann's theology, like an optic through which to interpret a lot of what he writes, is the word solidarity. And he writes about, even when he reads Jewish theologians and, for instance, talks about the divine Shekinah glory, and this whole idea that God is going with his people into the desert. He is going with people into exile together with them. And then later on, of course, the Christological themes when it comes to Jesus Christ is the one who, through incarnation, became one with us. And then later on, Pauline theology as one who, left everything to step into this profound solidarity. So you have this idea of a God who doesn't stand on the other side of the abyss and the chasm, but actually stepped over to our side and planted his cross among the many crosses of this world. So it seems to me that one coming from this rich theology of solidarity, which is profoundly not simply theological in an arbitrary way, but it's deeply biblical, that somehow the writer of Lamentations doesn't have it. Is he too traumatized to make sense of this, perhaps a little bit too optimistic or poetic way of thinking about divine presence? Like, what is it about him that he's not able to draw? No, forget about future kind of New Testament sort of language, but even what is present in the Old Testament, this idea of God being with his people in the desert, that he's not drawing on that. What's going on here?
Yeah. Again, referring to perhaps Leonard Cohen, he has this in this album "You Want It Dark." He has this song where he says it's over, the water and the wine, right? It's over. So where is it? This is an experiment, so be kind. But it's kind of when I try to walk this path, this Jeremiah Lamentations path, and I end the book of Jeremiah with a weeping God, who is puzzled, who doesn't know how to continue, but who knows that he's committed. And it ends with something that God just never wanted to happen, namely exile. Then Lamentations turns this around, and the weeping one, the suffering one, is now the prophet or the poet. What this, I think, opens as a possible reading is that there are moments in life where God stops crying, or is perceived as somebody who is disconnected, who is no longer engaged, who is absent. Now, this is not what Lamentations is saying. Lamentations were pretty careful to not develop a negative theology in the sense of God does not exist. But he doesn't say God is my enemy. He says God is like my enemy. He doesn't also say that God does not hear our prayers anymore, but he presents a God who is intentionally putting clouds between us and him so that the prayers aren't going through. So obviously the painting that's happening is a God who very well knows what's happening, but who is just not responding, who is not. And in these moments where the suffering person doesn't seem to get any contact with God anymore, you need an intercessor. You need somebody who is picking up your pain and who is weeping for you and with you and accuses God because you can no longer do that. And to me, that's one of the central functions of the Book of Lamentations. It models to us a servant of the Lord who is picking up the crying of God that has no longer been heard. He is using language of accusations that the suffering person just cannot use anymore because the suffering person is exhausted. So this is kind of how I read Lamentations. I read Lamentations as a Moses figure, so to say, who is trying to argue with God. And I think this is not just wishful thinking. I would say my argument that I would try to make based on biblical texts is that we see something very similar in the end of the book of Exodus, where God and Moses are struggling over the question, whose people is this? So God says to Moses, you and your people, that is Moses, that you have redeemed out of Egypt. And Moses says, no, you, referring to God, you and your people. So it's a question about whose people are this. And at the moment where God seems to no longer want to claim ownership over the people, at that moment Moses steps in and says, you have to take ownership over these people. And I think something similar I see in Jeremiah Lamentation. So in the book of Jeremiah, the people are owned by God, my people, the daughter of my people. And that voice is then transitioning to the prophet, and he claims ownership of his people. And brings the people, so to say, back into the consciousness of God. So that's the way how I would read Lamentations. It's you and me perhaps are sometimes called into the intercessory task of bringing the lost, so to say, back to God and finding language that puts God in an unrestful position so that he has to act.
Yeah, but this is quite, again, leads to some very interesting questions, because it seems to me that you have almost, and I might have misheard you, but almost presented two sort of different visions of the divine that the book of Lamentation is presenting. And for me to explain it, let me just go a step back. And when you can see, when you look at the literature on theodicy, trying to resolve the problem of evil, that people usually try to weaken one of the sides of the claims about God. Either the claim that God is omnibenevolent, that he's entirely good, which Blumenthal is doing in that book that I mentioned, or perhaps that he is weak, this whole idea of the weakness of God. And this is something we see in many theologies, in Jewish theologies for sure, and certainly Bonhoeffer himself writes about this idea of a weak God. So it seems to me that on the one hand, that Lamentations is presenting this God who seemingly, I don't know, does he have some darkness in him? Why is he doing this to us? And then at the end, you kind of move to this other imagery of God who weeps with us, but doesn't actually intervene. And so my question is, if people who are suffering today and experiencing traumas of different kind, I don't think that people want a God who is dark and that is not in tune with certainly New Testament, I believe Old Testament theology as well. God is light and there's no darkness in him, right? 1 John. At the same time, they want something more than God being in solidarity with us. He wants a God who actually asks, not asks, but acts on our behalf. Jesus saying, if you ask in faith, it will be given to you. James' instruction, if the God will respond to the prayers of the faithful. So we want a bit more of a real acting, healing God, rather than this open-ended spirituality of Lamentation. So my question then is, to whom does Lamentations speak when people are not all looking for openness and living under the question marks? They're looking for closure and divine intervention. So how can we absorb this text into what is going on with us in our current age, individually and then also broadly, more broadly?
Yeah. I mean, you might have seen it in the end of the commentary I'm writing, that Lamentations should not be read as the only book of the Bible, because then it would really end dark. But it's one voice of concerts of voices that all need to be read in order to make sense out of it. And I think in that way, when we read, obviously, I would apply here canonical theology or an overarching Old Testament theology. If we would look at Lamentations playing a significant role in that symphony of voices, then I think it falls into place. If we were just to have texts where God responds and acts to our prayers, it would just be very unrealistic, because that's not how the real life is feeling, or the real life reveals itself to us. If we only had voices like those of Lamentations, it will also be unrealistic. So I think each phase in life, or episodes, or times in history will need one book more than another. And I think that's where I find it so fascinating that the Book of Lamentations has been upheld and has been integrated into the biblical canon. If you think about at least my own denominational background, or our denominational background, right, as Seventh-day Adventists, you could say Lamentations is part of the censored material. So we don't preach on Lamentations. You just cannot preach on it, you sometimes feel, right? Except these few verses in the center of chapter 3. So there's a lot of censored material in particularly the Old Testament. But if we would bring these censored materials to the fore, I think we would be able to address a much wider audience, namely people who are suffering, people who have lost the vocabulary, who are exhausted in describing what they're in. They might be able to do exactly what they might be able to benefit by exactly what Lamentations is doing, saying, if you're voice has become still, I'll continue with that voice. You're suffering, I will continue the suffering voice, and I'll bring it into the most beautiful, sharp, aggressive, accusational modalities to God. I will not underperform your silenced voice, so to say. That's, I think, what's so beautiful. And again, this is a theme that I would say, that the theme of censored materials, a theme that I also see in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah is, if we take those two books together, in Jeremiah, we actually have an episode of it getting censored, right? It being cut and thrown away and being burned in Jeremiah 36 by Jehoiakim. And in a similar way, that's what the faithful community does with the book of Lamentations. We like to cut it, and throw it into the fire and not speak about it. But it has a place. It has an important place for the suffering people of God, and perhaps for the suffering of the world, because it does not say that we should not pray anymore. It says that God seems to not answer, and therefore we yell louder. And therefore we accuse God louder, because if we really accuse him, we will hit him so deep that he will wake up, so to say, that he will not let this stand by itself, and he will act again. And so I almost read the end of the book of Lamentations as kind of a final trigger. So this, I think, the ESV has put it okay. So the end of the chapter: restore us to yourself, O Lord. That's the positive theology, right? The God who is merciful, who has mercy on you every day, that we may be restored. So it triggers kind of this positive character, these deep hopes that God has expressed over multiple pages in the Old Testament, and obviously has revealed this type of feature in the coming of Christ himself. And then it taps into this other one, right? Or have you utterly rejected us? So I mean, it puts God into a wedge, so that which is unbearable to stand in, God has to act. And if you read it from a canonical perspective, this is what happens in the later books then of the Old Testament. God actually acts with a post-exilic community.
This reminds me, this beautiful point that you're making reminds me quite a bit again of our Theology conversation, during which we mentioned Marilyn McCord Adams and her notion of horrendous evil or horrors. Sometimes when we talk about human suffering and God acting and helping, we're thinking about daily, perhaps individual disease, which, it's horrible, but it's, having cancer is horrible, but wouldn't really fall under horrendous evil. It's just the plight of humanity that we get sick, and sometimes God acts and sometimes doesn't. But we have this horrendous evil, and she writes about, incest, dismemberment of the body, torture, where the human being is completely, the concubine in the book of Judges, and these horrible evils, which actually stop language. Like there's nothing you can say. And it seems to me that what Lamentation is doing two things. First of all is that there are people who are experiencing what Job is experiencing, but without being graced by a theophany that brings the resolution. Not everyone experiences the speech of God on the whirlwind. Some people go through Job's suffering and then they die without any answers. And I think the Book of Lamentations wants to remind us, that this is really a tragic book. And people have written a lot. And at some point in my life, I was really very much intrigued about tragic theology. And first of all, it's very difficult to describe what tragedy is. It's a whole genre. But can we actually speak of tragic theology when Christianity is fundamentally a religion of hope? And the fact is, no, ultimately, Christianity is not a tragic fate, because we have the book of Revelation and God bringing about, the tree for the healing of the nations. But penultimately, we have Job-like experiences without any resolutions in this life. And I think the book of Lamentations is a testimony to that. And is also a testimony to the different pastoral postures that we need to assume in life. And that precisely that there are no, sometimes just sitting with the person who suffers. No, oh, just believe in God, just claim the promises, just manifest God acting in your life. It often happens, and God is marvelous, and I've seen people being healed of all kinds of things. But often it doesn't happen, and it absolutely does not make any sense. The God, why don't you? I know one person, and just so suffering from cancer, being eaten out. And then first you pray that God heals the person and it doesn't happen. And then you plead with God, please let him die. And he doesn't die, but screams, and I'm thinking of a pastor actually that happened in Croatia, screams in suffering that no medication can help, and he dedicated his life to be a servant of God, and nothing is happening. What is the literature, and what is the existential and spiritual posture that is proper to such experiences? And it seems to me that the Lamentations perhaps could be invited into that space. I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, I think 4 years ago, I was in Germany, and we were, with the family, were climbing in the Fränkische Schweiz. It's like a middle mountains in northern Bavaria. And at the end of the day, we went to a little chapel. It's a Protestant region of Bavaria in Pottenstein. So it's a very, very small little chapel. And I went into the chapel, and I like to usually look in Protestant churches at the balcony because it has often quotes of the Bible, or it has figurines, right? And it was the first church that I've ever seen why it was such a surprising experience, that was quoting on 12 tablets. So they had 12 tablets on the balcony. A little church, perhaps 30, 40 people could have fit that church. Ancient church, I'm sure perhaps 500 years old or something like this. On each of the tablets, wooden tablets, it has engraved some of those darkest verses of Lamentations. And when I read that, I thought, that's not censored material here. So I don't know the story of this community. I don't know where they went through. But obviously, this has become a house of prayer where they felt comfortable to pray these verses. And that's what they needed. And that's what built this community. And that's how they brought, so to say, their prayer sacrificially to the Lord. And there are these moments where perhaps a congregation, or where a person or people group cannot pray any other prayer authentically but the prayer of lamentation. And that's fine, and that's good, and that should have its proper place in the community of faith, particularly if you can pray this prayer with a knowledge of the other books. You can even pray it more authentically, and you can scream it even louder. So this little church, I hope I return to that church once again. This summer I'll be spending some time with my parents.
Take
and
some
perhaps I can
photos
go
if
to
you
the
can.
church.
So
I took photos. I just need to find them again. But so that's kind of how I see, similar to what you're saying. We need the words of Lamentations because they give you the right, so to say, to also speak these types of prayers into the face of God.
What a beautiful way to bring this to a slow end. And I would like just to do this by sharing a brief story, and then I think we can leave it at this. And this is something that I might have shared to you. I often do share it when I teach. I've heard this shared by Dallas Willard, who is a well-known spiritual writer, and he writes about this experience, how a missionary in Africa, they were missionaries, gave everything to the Lord, served God, and then both of their sons contracted malaria. They only had 2 children. And one of their sons died in Africa, and the other one, they flew back to the United States to provide him with good medical care, obviously praying, fasting, and he died. And so you have this family that has given everything to God. Both sons died. And obviously the natural question is, God, couldn't you have just saved one of them? Why this waste? Like, why not? Why not? And Dallas Willard asked her, this lady, and asked, well, how did you survive in that? How did your faith survive in that circumstance? And she said a sentence that stayed with me all these years. She said, I decided that God is good. So I will, I heard this Jeremiah yet or but, to use some homiletical license, this affirmation, because whatever Jeremiah does, he's not becoming an agnostic and an atheist.
Right.
He is consigned to silence, but that silence is the absence of speech, which still is able to sustain faith in God and faith in the goodness of God, which is so absolutely unbelievable. And I can only pray that God leads us into this deep maturity, that even when we are completely silent, we do not leave. We stay. In our own ways, we find ways to say this, yet divine mercies are new every morning. So for me, that is this apex of what it means to be a Christian, even in the absence of answers. So perhaps we can...
Beautiful.
That's the last thing I'm going to say.
Yeah, beautiful, Ante. I was thinking about a poem of Leonard Cohen, but we do that another time. There are many. It's just interesting, yeah? So how many stories we could tell will actually fit this type of genre of Lamentations.
Yes. Thank you so much, Oliver. I can't wait for a commentary to come out. It's going to be a blessing to people who are seeking faith in a different register, rather than always everything being neatly packaged and resolved. And I think we need that, and it's going to be, I think, beautiful. Can't wait for it to come out.
Thank you, Ante, for the kind words.